Good evening, one and all, and welcome to the Signum Symposium, all about Sir Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy and his ongoing Book of Dust trilogy. We are here tonight celebrating the new release of Book 2 in the Book of Dust, Volume 2, I should say, because it's Volume 2 of one book. It's The Secret Commonwealth. It came out just yesterday. It's still got that new book smell. It's fresh off the press. We've only just got our copies. We're not going to be delving in too much to this book because we haven't read it yet, and we want to take our time with it, and we don't want to spoil things for people who are behind and so on. But we are going to be celebrating this new release by talking about Philip Pullman's work more generally, and hopefully answering some questions about it. And as always, if you are attending this live, it's wonderful to see you out here tonight. Thank you very much for coming. Do get involved, type out your questions, your comments. We'd love to hear from you as well. Before I introduce our lovely panel, I would just like to say a few things about Signum University because we are in the middle of our annual fundraising campaign. As you may know, we don't usually go on about fundraising at Signum because we prefer to talk about, orcs and demons and witches and witchcraft. But once a year, we do remind people that we are an educational institution, non-profit, that does rely on the support of donors and needs donations on occasion. And the theme for this year's annual fundraising is the next adventure because it's all about what's coming up for Signum University. For those of you who don't know, who are coming from outside the university, this is an online institution. You can find out more at signumuniversity.org. You can also find out more about how to donate if you would like to donate at signumuniversity.org/fund. And there you will see lots of information about where money would go and different rewards that you can get for donating different amounts and things like that. It explains it in full detail. Signum University is not like Jordan College, Oxford, made famous by the work of Philip Pullman. Jordan College is the grandest and richest of all the colleges in Oxford. It has expanded underground since the Middle Ages. It is said to be possible to walk to Bristol in one direction and London in the other, whilst never leaving college land. And the dons, the fellows of the college, like to drink Tokay wine. Signum University, on the other hand, is online, it's independent, it relies on donations to function as well. Just basic stuff like the web space and the web tools that we use to give broadcasts such as this one. The professors drink coffee rather than Tokay wine, so we're much cheaper to run than Jordan College. And it's not for me to say where you should give your donations, but I think Jordan College has enough money from the sounds of it, while Signum could probably use your money a bit more. So perhaps consider donating to Signum University rather than Jordan College, Oxford. It's also very expensive to send money to an alternative reality through PayPal, so consider that as well. Anyway, just wanted to give the plug to the fundraising campaign before we get into tonight's very exciting discussion of Philip Pullman's work. And I have the great pleasure in introducing our illustrious panel tonight. So firstly, we have Faith Acker, who holds a PhD from the University of St Andrews, where she wrote her doctoral thesis on the second edition of Shakespeare's sonnets. She's taught at various universities in the UK and the States, including Signum University, where she recently ran the course, The Life and Times of the English Epic, featuring Philip Pullman's The Subtle Knife, which is book 2 of his Dark Materials trilogy. Faith will be a library fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library, which is, I think, where you are now. Is that right, Faith? Are you there, Faith?
Indeed, yes. Sorry, I was muted. Yes,
Oh,
I'm at the Folger this fall and having a splendid time reading lots of old books.
fantastic. And then you're moving on to the Benique Library, if I'm saying that right?
The Beinecke, yeah,
The Beinecke Library, and then you're going to be going on to the Bodleian Library in
yes,
Oxford. And you're doing research on examining the portrayals of servants and tradesmen in 17th century poetical miscellanies.
yes,
Fantastic.
in real Oxford rather than alternate reality Oxford.
Although who knows where your research might take you. Um,
Indeed.
and moving on to Chris Swank, who is a preceptor at Signum University, focusing on Tolkien studies and imaginative literature courses. Chris is currently precepting Modern Fantasy 1, but I think soon to precept Modern Fantasy 2 in the next term.
Somebody is. I don't think that's me.
Okay, well, we'll talk a bit about the kind of fantasy courses at Signum. And you're doing Modern Fantasy 1 at the moment. You're also the library director at Puma Community College in Tucson, Arizona, and a postgraduate student at the University of Glasgow, studying with Dr. Dimitra Fimi. And you have published in Tolkien Studies, Myth Lore, the Journal of Tolkien Research, and a dozen edited collections. Chris's essay, The Child's Voyage and the Imram Tradition in Lewis, Tolkien and Pullman, will be published any day now in Myth Lore, volume 135. So this is an article that compares C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Philip Pullman. It's about to come out any day now, so that's I'd love to talk to you about that a little bit later. And thirdly, we've got Wesley Shantz, who works as a substitute teacher in Spokane, Washington. Is that right, Wesley? I've got that. Spokane, isn't it?
You say Spokane. I don't know why.
Spokane. Spokane. I don't know. Your biography is full of names I don't understand, so I'm going to keep on going, and then you can tell me how I've mispronounced them. You've worked at the Writing Center at Washington College and the Graduate Writing Assistant at St. John's College, Annapolis.
Got it.
And you have been doing a podcast series for about a year now, looking at Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, and I believe you're about halfway through The Subtle Knife.
Yes, roughly midpoint of the series, and I've got the big third book ahead, which I'm really looking forward to digging into again, because I haven't read it as much as the other two. It's a really fun project, and you've participated in it a couple of times now, so thanks for that.
It's a fantastic podcast. And so if you go to what's the best way of accessing the podcast?
Any podcast provider should have it. If you search for this weird title, a bookworm, not bookworm like a dragon, right? But bookworm like the temperature. Bookworm, all one word. That should come up, and you can find it that way.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for coming out tonight. I should mention myself as well. My name's Gabriel. I'm a preceptor and lecturer at Signum University. I did my PhD at Oxford University, where I live. I've lived in Oxford all my life. I've been a fan of Philip Pullman since I was a teenager, since I was about 12. And very excited to talk about Philip Pullman tonight. And we've got a comment from Sharon who says, I haven't read anything by Philip Pullman yet. Sell it to me. That's fantastic to hear, because one of the reasons for doing tonight's event is partly to collectively discuss Philip Pullman's work with fans, but also to talk to people who haven't read his work yet, and to for them to, maybe they've heard of Philip Pullman, they want to see what the fuss is about. And hopefully we can do a good job of that tonight. So let's just launch in, I think. Wesley, we talked a little bit about your podcast. You must have spent about 50 hours going through His Dark Materials. Why did you pick Philip Pullman? And why are you what makes you keep going through these books?
Yeah, I loved these books as a kid, have returned to them over the years to reread. And now that he's coming out with his new sequels, prequels. He calls them equals in some places.
Yeah.
There's this kind of excitement, in the air as the new HBO series is coming out too, produced by the BBC, right? And I think he even had some advertisements for it at the end of the Game of Thrones, right? So that's put him back on the map these days. And I was inspired by Corey Olsen and Signum and Mythgard and the kinds of things he does with Tolkien. Wanted to try my hand at making podcasts and got together with some friends and just sort of jumped into it. The first ones I made were about video games that I played growing up, because I thought that would be sort of like a new area for people to study. Turns out there's actually a whole lot of stuff about those already. And fun as it wasn't really breaking any new ground. But it's an interest of mine. So the game Earthbound for Super Nintendo was the first thing. And then I thought, a good sort of counterpart to that was the work of Philip Pullman as something that was really formation for me as a person growing up and being the age of the characters in the book, made me sort of think about what it means to grow up. And so that's kind of the lens that I've taken with it. His relationships between his characters within themselves and their demons, these kind of embodiments of their soul or something like that, their conscience, has been kind of the thing I've tried to focus on as I'm rereading it, and how that develops and how it reflects some things about telling stories, about knowing and believing, about innocence and experience, these kinds of things. So there's a ton of stuff in these books. I've tried to get in touch with scholars who have published in these areas and kind of enter into conversation to get out of my own head a little bit and see what other people have thought and said already. And yeah, it's been a really fun project, one that I hope brings more attention to the books and more scholarly interest in them, perhaps. But that's up to the audience, I guess.
Well, yeah, and I think you put that so well that for you, though, these books have been formative, and I think I would agree with that for me as well. I read these as a teenager and as a young adult, and they really helped shape my consciousness in ways that other books haven't done. Because I grew up with Harry Potter at the same time, and I love Harry Potter in a different way. But for me, Philip Pullman is the kind of the great, profound, influential writer. And you touched on why that was, because he talks about such big topics in his books. It's touching on these big ideas. And you also mentioned about demons. So just to explain, a demon has the appearance of an animal, and it's a manifestation of your soul. Northern Lights, which is the first book in his Dark Materials trilogy, you may know it as The Golden Compass, which is the title it was given in America. Northern Lights is set in this alternate reality version of Oxford, where everyone has these demons, which are these manifestations of their souls. And for children, their demons can turn into different animals. For adults, their demons are settled into one shape. So it's a really interesting way of exploring different ideas. Faith, I don't know if you've sort of, feel the same way that Wesley and I have felt about Philip Pullman, that it was formative and so it's such a profound mixture of ideas.
Actually, for me, it was quite the opposite. And I see you have some things about religion on here on your list of potential topics. But I was quite hostile to Pullman the first few times I encountered him, which was actually in college as an undergraduate in a fantasy course where we read him alongside a number of other authors, including Harry Potter, and also some works by T.H. White. It was a lovely span of fantasy. And it took quite a long time, and I think it really a lot of work for me to mature as a reader before I came back to Pullman with a new appreciation. I've always thought he was a brilliant writer, and I actually love his children's work, which I'm sad we won't be talking about, but The Firework Maker's Daughter is probably one of my favorite books in the world. So if you want a fun thing to start Pullman with, especially for those of you who are really new to Pullman, I'd really recommend that, although the Northern Lights and Spoke of Dust are a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, and I agree with about the children's works. Although it's interesting that you refer to the children's works as if his Dark Materials isn't part of that, which I know where you're coming from, but sometimes they are also lumped in with children's literature, aren't they?
It's funny because when I was in college, I bought all 3 of the books. We only read, I think we must have read The Golden Compass in my course, but I wrote a paper on Pullman. And at the time at which I drove to Borders, which was still alive then, I think they're gone now, and purchased the book, you could buy The Golden Compass, because it's America, with that title, in the children's section with a polar bear on the cover. And in fact, that's the copy I have. And then you could buy it in the teen section with the Golden Compass on the cover. It looks a lot more like the one you've got up on the screen. And then you could buy it in the adult section with this sort of glossy bronze cover that looks a lot more like my amber spyglass cover. So they've really done a fantastic job of marketing it for all ages. But I think what I'm counting as children's literature is much simpler in its scope and more playful, I think, than the Golden Compass and the Northern Lights.
Yeah. I mean, something like Clockwork is, I think, an incredible story, and that's another one of Philip Pullman's works. Again, another really good one to start with if you're new to Philip Pullman. Well, what about you, Chris? Where do you fit in with Philip Pullman?
I didn't find Pullman until I was an old adult. I think I'm older than all of you folks, and had already spent quite a bit of time reading Tolkien and Lewis and Rowling. And like Faith, I loved Northern Lights, Golden Compass. It's the same book, just 2 different titles. I loved it. And then The Subtle Knife, I was really intrigued by. And then I got to the Amber Spyglass and I hated it. And I think that happens to quite a few people. And I put it down and I walked away. His writing is great, but I didn't like where he went with the story. And then I just kind of came around that I don't have to agree with every author on every point, right? I don't have to have his same worldview, but I loved his world building. I love his writing, and I went back to it and read it a second time, and I just fell in love with it the second time. So I know, Sharon, I'm probably not selling it to you by telling you I hated the Amber Spyglass, but it's really deep and rich, and it's the kind of thing you can read as a child and get something out of it, and read it as a teenager and get something more out of it, and then go back as an adult and have some really interesting conversations in your head with what he's writing about. Religion, the way the world works, conversations with Milton, basically.
Yeah, Milton and Blake as well, and in some ways written in opposition to C.S. Lewis and even Tolkien as well.
He's been called the anti-C.S. Lewis,
Yeah.
He goes in a different direction from the same starting point.
Right. That's a very good way of putting it, actually. Yeah.
I want to jump in because you've mentioned Milton, and I love Milton. And I think the thing that turned me back to the Amber Spyglass favorably was actually rereading this for my epic class last year and reading it right after Paradise Lost and finding all of these wonderful subtle parallels. And I think somewhere, I don't remember where now, but Pullman said that this is actually the Milton for teenagers, I think. And it does a really nice job of retelling the same story and hitting many of the same plot points, but of course going in a very different direction at the end.
Right. Yeah. So we've been skirting around the issue a little bit of religion, and I think maybe you should fill that in for the listeners, especially those who aren't so familiar with Pullman's work. One of the characteristics of this alternate Oxford is that the organized church in that world, the form of Christianity called, which they call the magisterium, is a kind of despotic, authoritative regime, and by the point when you get to the Amber Spyglass, Pullman is making a much broader point about God and religion and rebelling against God and the Adam and Eve story. And, without giving away details or spoilers, the thrust of it is that Adam and Eve were right. Good for Eve to eat off the tree of knowledge. What's wrong with knowledge? What's wrong with growing up? Rebel against tyranny. That kind of thing, which is obviously a different kind of approach to how C.S. Lewis went about it, and I suppose Milton as well. You sort of hinted at that, Faith, that kind of they end up in different conclusions. Is that fair to say about Milton, that he wouldn't have approved of Philip Pullman's conclusion?
I don't want to speak for Milton, but I certainly think he would have had some real trouble, I think, with the conclusions to the Amber Spyglass in particular. There's a lot. Philip Pullman isn't, I don't want to say he's hostile to religion. I think in one of his early interviews quite a long time ago, he called himself a Book of Common Prayer atheist. So he's very familiar with the trappings of especially the modern day Episcopalian Church in England, or the Church of England. But he certainly has many issues with the way that the church is run and many of the ways that theology is presented. And that comes through very strongly. And I've had many religious students, and even myself when I was younger, respond very strongly and very negatively to Pullman. And I don't want to say that Milton would have responded to the same way, but I think he would have had some serious concerns about where things go.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in,
please,
Gabriel? With the second time I read it, I realized that Pullman, who sometimes calls himself an atheist and sometimes an agnostic, and he's like, whatever, I'm a whatever. It's not necessarily rebelling against God. It's rebelling against organized religion that gets too totalitarian and encourages, through force, its followers not to think for themselves. So I think that's where I really turned around on the Amber Spyglass, is Pullman wasn't saying anti-God, he was saying anti-organized religion that's too strict.
Okay, yeah.
That's kind of where I think he wound up.
And if I can jump back in, I think one of the other things that a colleague recently pointed out to me is that most of the anti-organized religion very carefully happens in another universe. So he's very precise with which religion he's criticizing. He's not attacking any of our modern churches. He's attacking this other sort of, I don't want to quite call it a straw man, but it's sort of a straw man that he set up, because it's hard to imagine any organization being quite as vindictive and vile as that one. So,
like really strong Catholic Inquisition in fiction, sort of thing. Sorry, Wesley, I saw you were going to jump in.
Well, he mitigates that to an extent, I want to say, with his newer books that have just been coming out recently, where he has some more sympathetic portrayals of religious characters, a more nuanced sort of take on what they're up to, perhaps, and what they even think about other parts of their organized religion. This is still in the other universe, of course. None of his new books have dealt with our universe yet, though we'll see if maybe he gets there, but that I know of, or that I'm recalling. But anyway, his work led me to read Milton for the first time as a kid. Made me really interested in what this book was that he takes the epigraph from. And so I read, and then I read his work on Milton, his introductions and some of his speeches and stuff. And he evokes the power of Milton's language and, the brilliance of his thought and his argument in such a way to really, Pullman was a teacher, a school teacher, and he sort of leads you into this process of reading, and maybe reading other sources as well, to see what actually is said in the book of Genesis, because he sort of rewrites it, well, if you want to know, like, what's the real story, that would lead you into that. And so I think that my own religious, side of myself has been immensely deepened by reading Pullman and sort of being inspired by his writing. And I think that goes to your point about, he wants you to think for yourself. He wants you to be as sort of be as open-minded and as critical and as poetic a reader as you can, and sort of access all of this great stuff that's out there as much as possible without a preconceived dogmatic approach to it, which is tough because I think that's easy to read into his own books sometimes too. Like if he titles a book The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ, which is another one of his books, that's sort of like heavy-handed too, right?
You're right. He is sometimes a bit heavy-handed, but I agree. I think these books, not his Dark Materials and the Book of Dust, are mostly they're a bit more subtle about it, and the Amber Spyglass is maybe an outlier. The Book of Dust is expanding his thoughts in a really interesting way. He described the Book of Dust as the New Testament to his Dark Materials Old Testament back in the day before any of the Book of Dust was released. And that kind of made it sound kind of awful to me. And I was a bit worried about it. And then when La Belle Sauvage came out, which is the first part of the Book of Dust, I was really pleased because this was a story about a young boy called Malcolm who lives in an inn very close to where I live. And it's a book about him growing up and his adventures he has with a boat. And, it's not kind of this huge grand scale making a point about religion, which I think some people are kind of wary of in Pullman. And I just don't think it's as important as a thing as some people make it out to be. He is very much interested and focused on storytelling and character. And there's actually a quotation I saw in Waterstone's bookshop recently in Oxford. What can I tell you about it? Referring to the Book of Dust. The first thing to say is that Lyra is at the center of the story. And this is from a blog post he wrote on his website introducing the Book of Dust. He's saying Lyra is at the center of the story. Lyra is the main character in his Dark Materials as well. And I think that always comes back to Pullman. Who is the main character? What is her story? And that, I think, sometimes gets lost in this conversation about religion and so on. And Lynn actually posted a comment. She's posted an article from the Catholic Herald titled "Why Christians Should Embrace Philip Pullman." So there are some people amongst the Christian community who are saying, yeah, no, this is good stuff, we should be reading it. But my own point, and I think Wesley is, if I'm understanding you correctly, your point as well, is that actually he's interested in other stuff apart from this kind of point about religion. It's about storytelling, it's about character. Am I sort of encapsulating your point well enough?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think what we see in these books is a really interesting portrayal of a young character who is so full of life, right? She's curious, she's imaginative in her own way, and there's some tension about that, right? At points at which she is spinning out these yarns, getting herself into trouble, getting herself out of trouble with her kind of creative spark and her dynamism. And we see her sort of interpreting a lot of really tough ideas, right? And the way in which she does that reflects sort of her level of understanding and the things that she's learning from her experiences as she goes along. And I think that there's a really cool way in which, the reader is invited to inhabit her point of view in certain points. And then the masterful storytelling, he sort of will pull back, look at it from this other perspective. He'll allow you, through seeing what she sees, to see something bigger, right, that he's kind of getting at. And then within her perspective, there's always this kind of duality of her and her demon, who can sort of disagree about things, who can have good advice, which the other doesn't listen to, right? And this sort of tension is sort of in all of these different layers of the story, that it just has this kind of gripping quality to it that I don't know that anything else I've read really has. And as much as the classics that he's stealing from liberally are things that I've also enjoyed, mostly because I got into reading from reading this book.
Yeah, and absolutely. And also Kat points out in the comments that La Belle Sauvage seems much more influenced by fairy tales and folklore than religious fantasy, which seemed to be his main influence in the first trilogy. Yeah, we'll see how that plays out in the Secret Commonwealth, but certainly, yeah, that he does take things in an interesting direction in the first part of the Book of Dust. I just want to, before we talk a little bit more about religion and move on, I'm just sort of wary that people who are not so familiar with Pullman's works might have heard a lot of titles being thrown about. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. His Dark Materials comprises Northern Lights, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass, and these all came out in the 90s, if you include 2000 as the 90s, the end of the 90s. So 1995, 97, and 2000. And then we had a kind of wilderness time when we just had these companion texts, which here's one of them, Lyra's Oxford, very, very thin. It's a short story. It has like some nice maps and postcards and things in it, but it's not really a kind of a novel that we were wanting. And then in 2017, we had the publication of La Belle Sauvage, which is, as Wesley, you said, it's not a sequel or prequel, it's an equal to his Dark Materials. It's a companion novel. I think he thinks about it as one long novel, although I think La Belle Sauvage is quite different from the Secret Commonwealth. I mean, we skip forward 20 years in the new book. And then this book, as I say, has just been released yesterday, and it will be it's the second part in a trilogy. So we don't know when the third part is coming out. But just that's the kind of the big picture here. I just want to, before we move on from religion, Kat has asked a really interesting question, aimed especially at you, Faith, which is about Blake, and particularly Blake's quotation about Milton being of the devil's party without knowing it, and Pullman's commentary on that. Could you say anything about Blake and his Dark Materials?
It's been a while since I've read. That's in the Golden Compass, isn't it? Let me pull the quotation.
Yeah, I mean, he's also influenced. I think he's influenced by Blake in artistic ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some beautiful illustrations in these books, some of which I think were done by Pullman as woodcuts.
The one thing I want to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that marriage of kind of text and image is very Blakean.
Yes.
So go on.
And that's actually something I notice in a lot of Pullman's works, is the image and text go together beautifully. The one thing I will say about Milton and Blake, and it's been a long time since I've looked at that quotation from Blake. Blake, of course, has his own special theology that is, he believes, divinely inspired, and it's very different from the theology that he grew up with. Milton, we talked a little bit, I think Wesley mentioned that Genesis gets rewritten in the beginning of the Golden Compass and Northern Lights, and that's something that many religious readers might have trouble with at first, to see this different alternate text words added to Genesis. But one thing that's very interesting about that is that Milton also adds words and scenes and characters and ideas to the Bible. He's presenting it as a theological work, and it tells one particular theological narrative, but it isn't specifically a retelling of the Bible. It's a very specific, much like a very directed sermon. Here is what you should think about the the creation story, the fall of man, and even the gospel at the end in the last 2 books of Paradise Lost. So I would guess that Blake's idea has to do with the fact that Milton too is taking the Bible and making it something that it wasn't, particularly changing the religion to fit his own narrative and theological, or let's even say philosophical premises, and that might be why Blake is taking issue with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is something that Pullman is very comfortable with doing. It's also something that C.S. Lewis incidentally does, just takes it in a different direction, obviously. And yeah, I mean, just to think a little bit more about Milton. Pullman wrote an introduction to Paradise Lost where he says that you've got to listen to this poem aloud. You've got to read it aloud. You've got to think about the rhythm, the sound of it. Pullman has also talks a lot about his writing process. He says he can't write to music because he has to hear the words in his head. And Chris, you mentioned how beautiful Pullman is as a writer. Perhaps there is some kind of similarity between Milton and Pullman, just on a kind of almost mechanical level, and the kind of the rhythm, the flow, the music of their writing.
Yes, and in La Belle Sauvage, there are a lot of scenes. La Belle Sauvage is the canoe, by the way. You can kind of see that on the cover. It's the name of the canoe. And much more. But anyway, a large flood, kind of an unearthly flood, overtakes Britain, with a Y, alternate universe Britain. And the children, Malcolm and baby Lyra, she's about 6 months old at the time, and another girl go down the Thames. It's very flooded in La Belle Sauvage, Malcolm's canoe. And just the landscape descriptions that Pullman writes about as they're going past, and the storm, and he's very good with descriptions of land and scenery and people. He writes characters really well. You can have a character that's in a scene for one scene and you feel like you really know that character. So I think he has these people probably inhabiting his, subconscious, and he has to listen to them speaking to him while he's writing, which is why he can't listen to music.
Well, there's an interesting quotation by Philip Pullman. It came from an interview in the Radio Times a couple of years ago. He says, "Seeing the scene is tremendously important to me. I always have in mind a little checklist. Where are we? Where's the light coming from? What's the weather like? Who's there? Is the door open or shut? Things you'd want to know if you were directing the scene for the screen, I suppose, but I find it helps to build atmosphere on the page." And you do get that sense with the landscape and the locations. You can see it exactly in your mind. You know exactly where everything fits together. There's a kind of geographical sense of moving from east to west, moving through that doorway into that corridor in a way that some authors don't sort of encapsulate that, don't portray that. I think actually Tolkien and perhaps William Morris actually are other authors who do get that great sense of direction and space, and Ursula Le Guin as well. So Pullman's not sort of unique on this, but perhaps he's unique in how much he thinks about the details of those scenes and the details of those characters as well. I know there's a passage you want to read out from the Secret Commonwealth. Perhaps if you read it out, that might sort of illustrate some of the things we've been talking about, Chris.
It was one that was released in June, so I'm not giving any spoilers away, and it's not actually one that delves into his scenery at all, but I wanted to be able to set the stage for people coming to the Secret Commonwealth. In the first trilogy, his Dark Materials, Lyra's about 11, 12, 13. In La Belle Sauvage, she's a baby, and now Secret Commonwealth has gone 20 years in the future. Okay, so we've seen her as a young girl going through puberty. We've seen her as a baby. And we've also seen her demon, which is this, has now settled into the form of a pine marten. His name is Pantalaimon. She just calls him Pan for short. And when she was in his dark materials, she would get into trouble all the time. You know, she would hide in closets and listen to people. She would run across the roofs of her version of Oxford. And now she's a 20-year-old, having gone through many adventures. So this is just a short little bit. It used to be you who was impulsive, said Pan, and me who kept holding you back. We're different now. She nodded. Well, you know, things change. This isn't shoplifting, this is murder. I know, I saw it. And maybe by doing this, we'd help the murderer get away with it by interfering with the investigation. That can't be right. That's another thing, he said. What? You used to be optimistic. You used to think that whatever we did would turn out well. Even after we came back from the north, you used to think that. Now you're cautious. You're anxious. You're pessimistic. She knew he was right, but it wasn't right that he should speak to her accusingly, as if it was something to blame her for. I used to be young, was all she could find to say.
Wow. That's great. And just to remind...
So you don't even have to know Lyra, right? To know Lyra now.
Absolutely. And just to remind listeners, that is her having a conversation with her soul, essentially. That's what Pantalaimon is. It's a kind of...
So her conscious having a conversation basically with herself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that whole concept of demons and these animals that are these manifestations is really fascinating, and something that I think Pullman's really exploring in the Book of Dust. Faith, I had a question for you about this, and this is a bit of a weak question, so bear with me and see what you can make of it. But I remember talking about Homer with someone, and they said that there was a bit in Homer when Odysseus seems to be it's as if Homer's making some distinction between different sides of Odysseus. There's a kind of sense of perhaps inner psychology, or something that definitely happens is people act according to the will of the gods. There's a kind of like distinction. There's a dichotomy in characters. There's a tussling in some of this older fiction, some of these epics. I just wondered, do you see anything like demons in older literature that perhaps Pullman is drawing on?
It's interesting that you're phrasing that in terms of the will of the gods, because I think Pantalaimon is actually the opposite of that. He's not a force that she has to obey because she's compelled to do so, the way that in a classical epic, you know that Oedipus is going to kill his father and marry his mother. It's a very different thing. I think the thing I'm thinking of the most is maybe in the Odyssey, there's a lot of changing shape, a lot of disguise and pretending to be someone else. Athena in particular becomes many of Odysseus's friends at different times and has conversations with him in the guise of those other people. And that's probably the thing I can think of that's closest to the demon conversation. If you think you're having a conversation with your friend and advice you're getting seems wise because it happens to be coming from a deity who happens to know what you're supposed to be doing, that in some ways might be the same as Pantalaimon, who often acts kind of as Lyra's conscience in some of the older texts. That's probably the closest thing I can think of.
Right, but there's a big distinction there, as you say, because Pantalaimon is sort of from within, as a kind of like base. It's not sort of from on high like you get in kind of in Homer or whoever. So Pullman is doing something quite distinct with this and quite unique in literature, and I think it's opening up all kinds of interesting possibilities, as you know was expressed in that excerpt that Chris read out.
The only other thing I would add now is that maybe the chorus in Greek tragedy is more like the demon in Pullman, because the chorus is often reflecting internal thoughts that the character can't say or isn't going to say, or even
Right.
just elaborating upon them or countering the author. So perhaps the chorus.
Yeah, yeah, and more generally, even sort of the narrator in literature. Pullman talked about the narrator as a character in English literature, and he also talked about pantomime and demons in general as just a kind of mechanical thing to begin with. That he needed someone for Lyra to talk to work things through in the first book, and then he's only just, he hasn't finished exploring what demons mean and what the possibilities of those things are. And it's really, really interesting hearing you talk about Pullman in the context of epic, because he did feature in your course on the epic at Signum University, which is available to audit. What led you to include Pullman in amongst Virgil and Milton and so on?
Well, the last quarter of that course does talk about modern text, so I didn't just single Pullman out. We also actually read some James Bond, and we watched Hot Fuzz, and we read Perelandra. Actually, I think you lectured on Perelandra.
I did, yes, yeah, C.S. Lewis, yeah.
As I recall. So I was really interested in looking at the ways we don't really read formal epics today, except for the classic ones. I think many writers have tried to write the English epic, from Milton actually to Tolkien to Pullman, and there's often going to be an element in which most of those fall short, partly because of genre. Once you put it into prose format, you lose so much of the beautiful language that makes the classical epics poetical and narrative and oral in lots of other interesting, stunning ways. But these modern stories do take a lot from those classical epics, and I think Pullman does it just as intentionally as Tolkien and Milton did. Maybe not, I mean, he's drawing on Milton as well, and actually there's a lot of Dante in the Amber Spyglass, the third book in the first trilogy. But Pullman seemed like a really obvious choice as somebody who's doing that very intentionally, as opposed to maybe James Bond would be a great example, or actually we read Thomas Hardy, who doesn't do it the same way. They're bringing those things in unconsciously. But Pullman's drawing on Dante. He's certainly drawing on Milton. He's certainly drawing on some of the other classical epics. And it seemed like it would be awkward to leave him out. Actually, the hardest thing for that class was picking one book. And I would have loved to have done the Amber Spyglass, but it was so long, and you really need the other two to work. And so one reason that I chose The Subtle Knife had to do with the way in which it played with crossing over world boundaries, which is actually a really essential part of many epics, moving from heaven to earth to hell, or a combination of the above, and then dealing with immortal and mortal beings in the same place. So he's touching on all of those essential epic themes, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting, and Pullman gives a definition of epic in his essay on epics, which is in Demon Voices, his collection of essays. This is actually written as an introduction to a book on epics, and he begins, "Above all, an epic is big. It's about big things: death, courage, honor, war, shame, vengeance." And he goes on to talk about that, which isn't necessarily the most sort of subtle or nuanced definition of epic, but there is something about the kind of the bigness of his Dark Materials and the Book of Dust, which it seems very epic. And I know some people dislike the Amber Spyglass because they see it as too epic, too big, losing some of that intimacy of the earlier books that perhaps we've got back to in the Book of Dust. Is that something that you felt, Chris? Because I know you said you didn't like the Amber Spyglass when you first read it. I don't know if that opinion has changed, or if you could talk more about that.
I think you put your finger on it, and in the Book of Dust, we're back to the more intimate stories. Well, at least in La Belle Sauvage. I've only listened to the first 3 chapters of The Secret Commonwealth, so I can't really speak to that yet. Can we talk about what a great title that is? You know, getting back to Kat's point that it seems like the second trilogy is more interested in fairy tale and fairy. The Secret Commonwealth comes from a 19th century book called The Secret Commonwealth of elves and fairies, and this Scottish minister went around and tried to write down all of the great stuff about fairy creatures. And so I'm just waiting for all of that to explode in this new novel. I'm hoping. Don't let me down, Pullman.
It's certainly an interesting melting pot, isn't it, of different ideas and genres. And he talks about this in his afterword to the Amber Spyglass, when he says, I read like a butterfly, write like a bee. I steal from all kinds of areas, all kinds of stories. If I had a demon, it would be a magpie, because I'd be stealing things all the time. And I was thinking back to your point, Wesley, when you said that reading Pullman has led you to read so many other things. He's a great writer for that, isn't he? He really opens up your mind to stories in lots of different places.
Yeah, definitely. And so, yeah, I'd never heard of the Secret Commonwealth, like the original folklore treatise, compendium, weird thing. I tried to read it. I haven't got a physical copy yet, so I tried to read this old copy that had the F-shaped S's everywhere that I found online, and it was hard going. So I'm trying to get a copy that was put out by, I think, some publisher that does like the Moomin books that Pullman talks about a lot, the Tove Jansson books. Like, I'd never heard of those, but I was reading, you know, like, what are Pullman's favorite books? What does he recommend? He talks about the Anatomy of Melancholy as being like the greatest book. I've never even tried to read that, but I like looked it up because he mentioned it being really good. So there's this kind of wealth of erudition, and it's to me as an American reader, you know, I was always sort of fascinated by the Britishness of it too. You know, he's like got this really rich reading voice that he does when he narrates his own books. He has this kind of inside view of, you know, the great English realist novel tradition, as well as, you know, Milton and Blake and the poetic stuff. You know, he lives in Oxford, and, you know, I envy you getting to be there, Gabriel. Like, you know, you're sort of in this place that he transports and infuses into his writing. He's just a marvelous kind of Pied Piper, you know, sort of like leading you into literature and all kinds of great stuff.
Yeah, he's a real reader's writer, I suppose. And you mentioned realist. I mean, there's a fantastic essay again in Demon Voices, Writing Fantasy Realistically, which is well worth checking out. And he talks about what his major influences are, and he talks about George Eliot's Middlemarch most of all. He says, I was embarrassed to discover that I felt so much at home writing fantasy, because I'd previously thought that fantasy was a low kind of thing, a genre of limited interest and small potential. I had thought, and I still do think, that the most profound, powerful, greatest novels I'd read were examples of realism, not of fantasy. And he talks about Middlemarch in the following paragraph. It's not, he doesn't fit in with other fantasy writers necessarily, or at least our idea of them. His books don't necessarily fit alongside some of the fantasy works that are on the scene as well. He's bringing in not just Dante and Milton and Blake and Genesis, but also George Eliot, Jane Austen, and then you get this kind of beautiful blend and this mix in his work. He was on the Adam Buxton podcast recently. It was just released today, and it's a wonderful kind of interview with him, because you can hear him pottering about in his workshop, because he's a carpenter as well, and taking his dogs for his walks and their walks and so on. And he talks about how he started off being published as children's literature. So, you know, his Dark Materials was published for children, even though I think it is more than just a children's story, and it's quite hard to classify. But he said this was what really helped it find its audience, because people who like fantasy know what they like, and this doesn't quite fit in with a lot of modern fantasy. People who are adults who don't like fantasy won't touch anything that has the fantasy label on it. But children's literature, although there's a bit of a stigma about reading something for children, yet it doesn't fit into one single genre. It's a kind of broad church, and these publishers have been very good at marketing the books for different age groups, which is much easier to do than different genres. So I'm just interested in the panel's thoughts on where you would place Pullman. Chris, you're teaching in the modern fantasy class at the moment. Would Pullman fit in with the other authors in that class, or would he fit in somewhere else?
I think so. The authors that we have in there include Peter Beagle, Ursula Le Guin, Garth Nix, Jim Butcher. So we have a variety of people that attack this beast that we call fantasy from many different points, but they all have some kind of magic or some kind of conversations with talking animals. I mean, there's some standard fantasy things that Pullman also includes. I think he would fit in with the modern fantasy class.
But I remember going to Blackwell's with you when you were in Oxford a few weeks ago, and we went looking for Philip Pullman.
He wasn't in fantasy.
He wasn't in fantasy. He wasn't in children's. We couldn't find him because it was Oxford. They had their own Philip Pullman.
He was in the Philip Pullman section.
Which is, where else would you put him? But also that's Oxford. So this is a photograph of, this was taken yesterday when the book came out, a big book display in Waterstones. I mean, Oxford really loves Philip Pullman, at least the book community does. So, we can give him his own section of the bookshop in Oxford. But where do you put him elsewhere? Do you put him in children's? Do you put him in fantasy? Do you put him in amongst Blake and Dante and Milton? And do you put him for adults or children? Wesley, you read him as I read him as a young person. Chris and Faith, you read him as an adult. Did either of you feel that this was a children's story, or that this was for children, or did you just think this was a good story? Faith, if you could answer first.
Well, in the context in which I read him, we had just read Harry Potter and The Once and Future King, both of which I think are also books that you can easily give to children and have them enjoy. And I think something that makes us classify books as children's books tends to be having child protagonists. And certainly all three of those books do. At the beginning of The Once and Future King, Arthur is a schoolboy, and Harry Potter starts out in sort of high school, late middle school, high school. And again, Lyra is quite a young girl when we meet her. But I don't think that in fantasy, having child protagonists means that they have to be children's books. I think actually of all the series that have had child protagonists, the one that I've met the most resistance with adults has been Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia. When people read that for the first time as an adult, they do feel it's very juvenile. I don't think you get the same feeling for that from Pullman.
Yeah. And would you agree with that, Chris? What was your experience of reading Pullman as an adult?
Yeah, I think children could really enjoy, especially the first couple books, and then maybe grow up with it. But I was an adult. I didn't feel like I was being talked down to the way Lewis sometimes, and I love Lewis, but sometimes he does. So I don't feel that way about Pullman.
And we've been talking a little bit about Tolkien and Lewis just on the periphery. You've just written this new essay exploring the similarities between these three writers. Is that fair to say, similarities, or are you sort of picking out the differences as well?
They all three have a story where some children go out on the water and have adventures. And my thesis is that they're all three based on, and it's Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Tolkien's Roverandom, and Pullman's Book of Dust, La Belle Sauvage, so the one immediately prior to this one. And I think they're all three authors are hearkening back to a medieval Irish format called the Imrav. And you'll just have to read my essay to get more in depth into it. But it's they all three hit a lot of the points that the medieval Imrav hit, and I think Pullman is answering Lewis's Dawn Treader in a lot of ways in La Belle Sauvage. That's kind of my thesis.
Okay.
Doing his Pullman thing, not imitating Lewis, but like same starting point, different directions.
Right. And of course, he met Tolkien briefly at Exeter College at a dinner. He's been very critical of both Tolkien and Lewis. But this is his idea of literature. As you read it, you have an idea about it. You disagree with other people. He says that reading is a democracy, that writing is authoritarian because the writer, has to decide which words to choose and what he means or she means. But reading is a democracy, and so there's something kind of wonderfully broad about his reading practices and where he draws from and what he responds to. So, we're coming to the end of our time. I'd love to hear more from the audience actually about how you came to Pullman, whether you've been convinced by the discussion tonight to pick up Pullman if you haven't already, or whether you already are a converted member of the Church of Philip Pullman, if that's not an oxymoron. I thought we'd finish with a couple of things. One is just to mention the exciting news that his Dark Materials is being turned into a major new TV series produced by the BBC and HBO. It's coming out in a month's time. It looks very good. I don't know what the panel thinks about this. How are you feeling, Chris? Are you sort of nervous about it, excited about it?
James McAvoy, I will watch Read the Phone Book.
It's got a fantastic cast. And Lyra looks...
Ruth Wilson as Mrs. Coulter. I think the cast looks great, yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Wesley?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, and I just, again, hope that it kind of brings more people to read these books.
And you, Faith?
I've actually been really excited about this. I was quite disappointed about the film that came out a long time ago now. One of the things that was troubling for me in the film is they tried to cut out most of the religion and most of the philosophy, and that's the heart of the story. And I've only seen that very short, maybe 3-minute trailer that the BBC released, but it looks as though they're going to embrace that more thoroughly, and I'm quite excited. And of course, yes, the cast is splendid, but I'm really excited to see what they're going to do with the philosophy and the fantasy together.
Well, we're all. It's a good time to be a Philip Pullman fan because we've got a new Philip Pullman book. Yeah, absolutely adore his writing. I think his themes, his ideas, the way he pulls in different authors, but just so kind of on a sentence by sentence level, his use of geography, his use of space, his use of character, I think is really really divine, again, to use a kind of oxymoronic expression. We've got a few comments. Kat says, I read these books in high school and I'm planning to reread soon since the show is coming out. And Joe says, I saw the movie, referring to The Golden Compass, and didn't like it. You all have convinced me I should read the book. Absolutely, you should read the book. And please let us know how you get on with it. I think you will love the book, and I hope it encourages you to read the others as well, and including the ongoing Book of Dust trilogy. And I hope it encourages all of you who are reading Pullman to read the people that Pullman has been writing, has been reading as well, as Wesley has been doing. Yeah, I haven't yet read the Secret Commonwealth original yet either, but it certainly led me to Milton. and to look at Blake in new ways as well. So Pullman's a great reader's writer. I thought we would end on oh, sorry, and just a comment from Rachel. I suddenly want to reread now since I just read them all really quickly during Dr. Acker's class. It's fantastic that actually you were introduced to Philip Pullman through Dr. Acker's epic course. And interesting that he fitted in very well to that course as well, but he would also fit into a modern fantasy course, as Chris says. So perhaps every Signum course should have a bit of Philip Pullman in it. There's an idea. Anyway, I thought we'd end
Signum course.
all that. Yeah, why not? Well, watch this space. Maybe that will happen. Maybe if you donate enough money, you can make it happen. Just to go back to that idea of the annual fund again. I thought we'd just end with a bit of fun. We'd just do a bit of a reading of the beginning of the new book, since this is a celebration of the release of the Secret Commonwealth. So I thought I would just read out like a page or two, and then we'll see how we go. Perhaps someone else on the panel would like to read out a bit, or perhaps even an audience member, if you'd like to be unmuted and read a little bit. I'll just start with, firstly, I mean, I don't know what the US editions are like. This is the UK edition. The cool thing about this is if you take the cover off, it's probably a little bit difficult to tell on the webcam, but there's like a sparkly under cover, which is the dust. And then you have a bit of text on the spine itself, which is really cool. I've never seen that before. And then the inside is beautifully illustrated. But I thought I'd just read out a little bit from the beginning. The author's note. Chris, did you say what did you say about James McAvoy, that you'd watch him reading out a shopping list or something?
Sure.
Well, I feel a similar way about Philip Pullman. I would read his shopping list because it would be beautifully written. If it was written by Philip Pullman and read out by James McAvoy, then I think we've got the perfect dream team there. But anyway, this is just an author's note, but I think it's beautifully written and it sets up this book. He says, "The Secret Commonwealth is the second part of the Book of Dust. The central character, Lyra Silvertongue, once known as Lyra Balacra, was also the protagonist of a previous trilogy, His Dark Materials. In fact, her name was both the first word and the last in that work. In that story, she was about 11 or 12 years old. In the first part of the Book of Dust, La Belle Sauvage, Lyra was a baby. Although she was central to the story, most of the action of that book concerned a boy called Malcolm Polstead, himself about 11 years old. In this book, we skip 20 years or so. The events of His Dark Materials are 10 years in the past. Both Malcolm and Lyra are adults. The events of La Belle Sauvage are even further away in time. But events have consequences, and sometimes the effects of what we once did take a long time to become fully apparent. At the same time, the world moves on. Power and influence shift, or increase, or diminish. And the problems and concerns of adult people are not necessarily the same as the ones they had when young. Lyra and Malcolm, as I say, are not children anymore." And then you have this quotation from Blake: "Everything possible to be believed is an image of truth." You already can see what kind of text this is, kind of profound, but also really focused on character. This is Lyra's story. But not too bogged down in details. He's not quite sure if she's 11 or 12. He also has no idea instantly how demons are born. This is a question he gets asked in interviews all the time. He doesn't know because it's not pertinent to the story. The story comes first and the character comes first. Shall I go on a little bit further, or would someone else prefer to read the first page? I don't know how you feel, panel. Chris, you've already read out a little bit.
And I only have the audiobook, so I can't.
Is this Michael Sheen? Is that his name?
Yes,
Yeah, I've listened to a bit of that audiobook and it's beautiful.
He's just done Good Omens, so yeah.
And he's just had a baby daughter called Lyra.
Wow, good for him.
which is very cool. I'll read out a little bit more, if I may, if you'll indulge me. I won't do as good a job as Michael Sheen, and then we'll end for the night. So, chapter 1, Moonlight and Bloodshed. Pantalaimon, the demon of Lyra Belacra, now called Lyra Silvertongue, lay along the window sill of Lyra's little study bedroom in St. Sophia's College in a state as far from thought as he could get. He was aware of the cold draught from the ill-fitting sash window beside him, and of the warm naphtha light on the desk below the window, and of the scratching of Lyra's pen, and of the darkness outside. It was the cold and the dark he most wanted just then. As he lay there, turning over to feel the cold now on his back, now on his front, the desire to go outside became even stronger than his reluctance to speak to Lyra. "Open the window," he said finally. "I want to go out." Lyra's pen stopped moving. She pushed her chair back and stood up. Pantalaimon could see her reflection in the glass suspended over the Oxford night. He could even make out her expression of mutinous unhappiness. Would anyone like to read that second page? Faith or Wesley, or anyone in the audience?
I can read it if no one else.
Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to read off your screen since there might be some slight differences in the American stuff.
Oh, yeah, who knows? Yeah.
I know what you're going to say, he said. Of course I'll be careful. I'm not stupid. In some ways you are, she said. She reached over him and slid the window up, propping it open with the nearest book. Don't, he began. Don't shut the window. Yes, Pan. Just sit there freezing till Pan decides to come home. I'm not stupid at all. Go on, bugger off. He flowed out and into the ivy covering the wall of the college. Only the faintest rustle came to Lyra's ears, and then only for a moment. Pan didn't like the way they were speaking to each other, or rather, not speaking. In fact, these words were the first they'd exchanged all day. But he didn't know what to do about it, and neither did she. Halfway down the wall, he caught a mouse in his needle-sharp teeth and wondered about eating it, but gave it a surprise and let it go. He crouched on the thick ivy branch, relishing all the smells, all the wayward gusts of air, and the wide-open night around him. But he was going to be careful. He had to be careful about two things. One was the patch of cream-white fur that covered his throat, which stood out with unfortunate clarity against the rest of his red-brown pine marten fur. But it wasn't hard to keep his head down or to run fast. The other reason for being careful was much more serious. No one who saw him would think for a moment that he was a pine marten. He looked like a pine marten in every respect, but he was a demon. It was very hard to say where the difference lay, but any human being in Lyra's world would have known it at once, as surely as they knew the smell of coffee or the color red.
Well, the temptation is just to keep on reading and reading and reading, but we all have to other lives to live, and we can all read this book in our own time. But I just I thought it'd be fun to give a taste for people who are not familiar to Pullman, and also just to do something fun for those of us who are already fans of Pullman and excited by the new book. So thank you very, very much, firstly, to all of you for coming out tonight and participating in this live. Also, thank you to you for listening or watching later on if you've done that, and thank you very much to my wonderful panel, Faith, Chris and Wesley, for coming out tonight and giving us your thoughts on his Dark Materials and the Book of Dust. Hopefully we can do another Philip Pullman event in the future. It would be great to reconvene and talk about maybe the HBO BBC series, or part 3 of the Book of Dust whenever that comes out. Or perhaps even to reconvene to talk about the Secret Commonwealth once we've read it, and we can sort of go into detail about that. But thank you very much all for coming. Does anyone have any last comments or thoughts?
Especially to say thank you as well, Gabriel, for hosting.
You're very, very welcome. It's always a pleasure to do anything to do with Philip Pullman, and It was wonderful to share some of that joy with others tonight. So thank you all for coming out. Have a wonderful rest of your night, and happy reading, whatever you're reading and wherever you're doing it. So thank you very much, and good night.
Night.
Night.